welcome to the Roy Rogers Riders Club.
Thrill again to the thundering hooves and cattle stampedes, barroom brawls, and shootouts of classic Western features and TV shows. Annie Oakley, Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, John Wayne, and all their cowboy pals and sidekicks roam the West once more. Heroes never die on ComedyMX Channels. They just ride off into the sunset.
The Indian tells you it's time now for another true story of the West. And their friend is the man who knows the real West and its exciting history. Yes, it's time once again for Tim McCoy.
So this is Deadwood. Deadwood and the Black Hills. You know, the very mention of the word Deadwood conjures up a picture of the Deadwood stage being attacked by Indians, Deadwood Dick, you know, holding up people, bad men of the Old West, the Black Hills, Pasapa, the great medicine Black Hills of the Sioux Nation. And here we are. Isn't it strange how you go back and think about these places and the things that happened in these places? When Deadwood Gulch was filled with Indians, if they dare go in there. And then there was the gold strike and people poured in there from all over. First thing you know, saloons like this were built up along the gulch, and then it turned out to be a city, big town. And into it poured all the riffraff and all the decent people that made up all of our old boom towns in the West. Well, you had people, when I was mentioning about Deadwood Dick, for instance, look at this old rascal here. Now, take that old fellow, for instance. It shows you what happens in some of these towns. You know, people try to perpetuate the romance and the history of our old West. And how could you do it better than Deadwood Dick? That's, of course, the funny part of it is, you know, there wasn't any such fellow. There never was a fellow called Deadwood Dick. Back in the old days when these dime novels were being written, you know, Deadwood Dick was just the brainchild of a writer back east, back in New York, a fellow who'd never been out west. So he started writing those fantastic tales about Deadwood Dick, the two-gun bandit of the West. Well, they picked it up, people believed it. They talked about Deadwood Dick, and then it was forgotten. Well, a few years back, people of Deadwood wanted to have a big celebration. They called it Deadwood Days, Frontier Days, Historical Days, whatever they wanted to call it. But they decided to have a great parade, historical pageant, showing sort of the progress of Pasapa, the Black Hills. Then somebody said, when they thought about the different characters, well, we ought to have somebody representing Calamity Jane, and Wild Bill, and General Custer. And then someone said, but what about Deadwood Dick? What would you do about Deadwood Dick? So they got an old-timer, fellow with a long handlebar mustache, and they dressed him all up, put him in the parade. He was to represent Deadwood Dick. They put buckskins on him, and he was just the sort of guy to do it. Long mustache, as I say, and he was just about the right age. So he was Deadwood Dick in the parade. Well, next day, he took off his buckskins and went back to his job in the livery barn, and everything was all right, and he was forgotten for another year. Parade came off next year, and they said, well, say, do you remember we had Deadwood Dick in the parade? Let's get the old boy out again. So they did this for about 3 years. He would come out for one day and be Deadwood Dick, and the next day he went back, as I said, to the livery barn or whatever his job happened to be at the moment. He was just an old roustabout around there. Well, then President Coolidge was going to take a vacation. He was going out west somewhere, and they said, we've got it. Let's send an invitation back to him by Deadwood Dick to come out and spend his summer in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Well, you always remember the pictures of Coolidge with the chaps and the Stetson hat on his head? They were rather funny, but Cal fell for it, and came right out. Well, what they did with this old boy then, here's the costume they put on him. They fixed him all out in a buckskin shirt, beaded gauntlets and a big sash on his waist and a Stetson hat. Said, you take this invitation back to Mr. Coolidge. So he went back, saw the president, delivered the invitation, and one look at him, he looked like all the old Western outlaws put together. Deadwood Dick was inviting the president personally. Well, as you know, Coolidge accepted the invitation, and he came on out. Well, that would have been all right, but someone in one of the travel agencies got an idea one day, and they said, I think it'd be a good idea to send this Deadwood Dick back to Chicago. We're having a big travel exposition back there, and send him back representing the Black Hills. So they dressed him up in that outfit again and sent him back, and they had pamphlets of Deadwood Dick, the Black Hills. The old boy was standing there, and inside they had a mock-up, you know, one of these dime novel ideas of what Deadwood Dick's life had been, where he was born, how many bar he'd killed, he'd fit Indians for years and years, so he had that in there. Well, one of the fellows from Deadwood came along, and by this time the old fellow's beginning to believe it. And this fellow up in the Dakotas came down and said, pardon me, sir, but are you Deadwood Dick? Said, yes, I am. He said, how long have you been in Deadwood? I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, I was just wondering how long you've been in Deadwood. Just look right there in that pamphlet. That just costs 10 cents. 10 cents for the pamphlet. Buy the pamphlet, you get my picture, tells you all about it, all the fool questions that you're asking. Just buy the pamphlet. 10 cents, please. And that old guy believed it. And from that day till the day he died, he became Deadwood Dick, and he never took off those clothes. Well, now those are just some of the characters that you found around in this country at that time. Of course, there were some real ones, too. When the people began pouring into this Deadwood Gulch from all over, you know, behind all the gold strikes and on the fringe of them would come a certain element of people, gamblers, bartenders, saloon keepers, because when men ever dug for precious metal, there were always men coming around who wanted to take it away from them. So on the heels of this great wave coming up into the Deadwood came Wild Bill Hickok. Gone from the days of Marshal of Abilene, Wichita, Ellsworth. He'd been out on the road with Buffalo Bill Show. Quite a character, that Hickok, you know. He came up here to see what was going on. He liked to follow on the first wave, wherever it came in. I'll never forget a description a Texas cattleman made of him. He said, the first time I ever saw this Wild Bill, he stepped out of a saloon. He was the town marshal. And he looked the town over, up and down the street. His head sort of swung from one side to the other. He was just like a buffalo bull on the prod. Didn't want trouble, but if anybody had anything, they could just bring it to him. And I made up my mind right then that I wanted nothing to do and no part of Wild Bill. So in came Wild Bill. Colorado Charlie Utter was with him. Calamity Jane was there. Calamity. Good old Calamity Jane. You know, I have to laugh sometimes when I see the way she's portrayed as a perfectly beautiful gal, blonde curls. Well, Calamity, you know, I saw Calamity Jane once. Must have been just about the year before she died, I imagine. She wa'n't no beauty. She had a broken nose, looked as though somebody had socked her with a bottle at some time or other. And she was a rough, tough old girl. And when they talk about her being the sweetheart of Wild Bill, don't believe it. Wild Bill, you know, was a very handsome and very fastidious fellow. Calam was an old gal that went about in men's clothes most of the time and would join a freight outfit that was going to the Black Hills, or a bunch of teamsters, crack a whip along with the rest of the teamsters in the quartermaster train, anywhere. That wasn't Wild Bill's type at all. He was very fastidious. Any women that were around there, if there were any women that were beautiful, they would have been delighted to have Wild Bill take his hat off and acknowledge them. So all this thing about Calamity Jane and Wild Bill, she went around with them when they first came into Deadwood, but they just took her along for laughs from one bar to the other. That's about all it amounted to. But aside from that, don't think anything about that calamity Wild Bill business. It was right in here, you know, that Wild Bill was killed, right in this very saloon. Bill was a man that had protected himself for years, and he was never known to sit with his back to a door or window. But right here in this particular spot, Number 10 was the name this saloon had in those days. There was a chair here by the door. Bill, when he came in, would generally sit over there, back toward the bar, toward the wall there. This particular day he came in, they thought they'd job him, and a friend of his took that chair, and Bill said, you mind if I sit there? Oh, said Bill, sit over there. This chair by the door is all right. Bill said, if you don't mind, would you move over and let me sit down there? I prefer that chair. Oh, he said, it'll spoil my luck. Bill, I can't do that. Go on, he said, nobody's going to shoot you in the back. Go over there and sit in the chair. Don't be superstitious, Bill. And very much against his will, quite reluctantly, Wild Bill pulled up the chair with his back to this door. First time it had ever happened. Bill, of course, a man who'd made his way through life by his guns. Well, take this pair of guns here they've got. This pair of cap and ball guns, cap and ball pistols. That's what Wild Bill made his reputation with. Down at Ellsworth in the early days. And then came the Colonel Colts, the peacemakers. That's what he maintained the reputation with. But strangely enough, the gun he had in his hand when he was killed wasn't as spectacular as any of those. It was the latest model Smith & Wesson. It tipped up, you see, and the cylinder came out. You loaded the cylinder, put it back in, and the gun was ready to fire all over again. And it was a handy little gun because you could carry it, you see, without having to put on a belt and holster. And he had that gun on that particular day. Now, the cards that were used, here's your original deck. That's supposed to be the deck that was used right on this table. You notice the difference between them and the cards that they use now? They've got no markings on the edges like these cards have today. They're a little bit different. But that's the deck. They were sitting right here when Jack McCall came in. Jack McCall was just a kind of a town bum. He didn't amount to anything. If Wild Bill had been killed by an upstanding man in a good gunfight, it wouldn't have meant half as much as it did by having this roustabout walk in, stand at the bar, come over, look at the game of cards, walk around until he was almost directly behind Bill. Stood over here for a while watching what was going on. Cards were dealt. Bill got his hand. The rest of the men got their hands. Then this fellow McCall wandered slowly around behind Bill, right where he could get out the back door, and quick as a flash, he pulled this pistol, put it at the back of Bill's head, and pulled the trigger. And Wild Bill, with his gun in his hand, fell forward. He got that gun out before he thought he was dead even. Here he was with his cards in his hand, but that pistol was in his hand, and there he was. And when they turned him over, he had two pair in his hand. Two pair that had become known for years and years. And there they are. Aces and eights.
For Tim McCoy.
Seska hilu kamtaksilten saika wawa. Na, hilum saika kamtaksilten saika wawa.
What? My old friend, Chief Ulachi here, he's a Yakima. I was up here visiting him. He started to tell me a story in signs. And then he realized that you who were visiting with us probably didn't understand the signs, and that's what he was telling you in his own language. He was saying, I'll bet you don't know what we were talking about, do you? You know, this sign language of the Plains Indians is very interesting because you can talk to all the Plains tribes, they'll all understand these same signs. And that's their universal language. So the story he was telling me, well, I'll let him continue the story and I'll interpret it for you because it's a story, an old-time legend. You know, all these tribes have their old-time stories. The story goes back and forth all around from one person to another. And they have their legends just as we have the stories of the creation of the world, things of that sort. And what he was telling was one of their great characters, Yell, you spell that Y-E-H-L, up in the Northwest, among those North Pacific Indians, Yell is a great fellow. And most of the time, he took the form of a raven, you see, with the wings. He's black and had this great beak. Now, this raven used to play a lot of tricks. But I'll let Ulachi tell you the story, and then I'll interpret it for you. Now he's going to go ahead. And they all start out when we say, once upon a time, the Indians always say, long time ago. So that's how we started. Long time ago, the raven, Yell, looked down and saw these Indian people.
Na. Ki. Mati.
Sun and moon. Now, the moon is a night sun. Night covers over and day opens out. Night sun, the moon, and stars that twinkle up there in the sky, cross, you can see the points of them. They didn't exist. No. The negative, you see. So the sun, the moon, and the stars didn't exist. So the raven looked down.
Who?
He wanted to give these red people happiness. Now, happiness, the heart is gay, everything is lively. So he changed himself. To exchange, you see, just exchanged his personality. He changed himself into a baby, into a child that had been born. And that child was possessed or belonged to the daughter. Now, that's a woman. They combed their hair. A man was that way. A woman, the way they wore their hair. The woman, child, meaning the daughter, of a great medicine man. Now, big, great medicine man. He was powerful. He possessed something that you have. He possessed the sun, the moon, and the stars. And he kept them, deposited them that way, in 3 boxes. And in his lodge, they were hung up. So the raven, child, cried, cried, and cried. And the grandfather, this magician, loved the child. He he held him to him. He was very close to him.
Inch. Na. Oof.
So he asked the child, why do you cry? And the baby said, pointing one of the boxes, that he wanted it. This box had the stars in it. So the old man reached up, took down the box, and gave it to the child. The baby opened the box, scattered out the stars until all over the floor were these stars sparkling all up, down, all over the floor. Yell, the raven, gathered them up and threw them out through the smoke flap in the teepee. His grandfather, now the sign for the grandfathers very often carry the children on their backs, or the parents. So that sign means a grandparent. The grandfather was angry. See, a great force was coming across his forehead. So the child said, that box, give me. So to cut off or stop, anything that's finished is cut off. To cut off the crying, the grandfather gave him that box. The moon was in that. The baby, or yell, opened the box, took the moon, rolled it round and round and round, and finally, when the grandfather wasn't looking, now to look, you see, you look this way, the direction of both eyes. And this is your negative, no. When he looked, no. When he wasn't looking, took the moon and threw that out through the smoke hole in the lodge.
Cool.
Then he cried and cried and cried. And the grandfather's heart was heavy. So he took down that third box. And Yell then exchanged, turned himself back into the raven, and in his beak he took the box and flew out through the smoke hole up there in the lodge. When he got outside, he found some Indians, different ones, and he told them that he was going to give them all the things that would make their hearts happy. So he gave them the sun, which is placed in the sky, the night sun, the moon, and all the little stars that you see up there. And that's the true story of how the sun, the moon, and the stars came into the sky and made the hearts of all the Indians happy. That is what the old people told me. That's their story, and I remember it. Well, until our next visit, as the old Sioux Indians would say, wash day.
Join us for another authentic story of the West when we again meet America's favorite Western storyteller, Tim McCoy.
Now, as I was saying a little while ago, that I realize very few of you fellows have ever been up over this Chisholm Trail. Some things about it you ought to know. All this trailing cattle north, you know, is a new business. But it's something we've got to get used to because it's going to mean the salvation of Texas. A lot of you fellows I know are ex-Confederate soldiers. You've come back home to Texas. What'd you find? You found cattle all over the countryside. Why, even old man Maverick hasn't branded one in years. Texas is rich in land and cattle. The only thing she hasn't got is money. Now, this Chisholm Trail is going to be the salvation of Texas, as I started to tell you a minute ago. It's all right to have cattle. It's all right to have land. But you've got to sell those cattle in order to maintain the land. And the luckiest thing that's happened to us is that they're beginning to build these railroads out across the western states to the north. All we've got to do is round up our Texas cattle, trail them north, load them on the railroads, and ship them to the eastern markets. Now, you know, the East has had to build up, too, after this war. You've got all those big manufacturing centers back there in the Yankee country. It's all right to work, but they have to eat. And they got to have beef. And we've got the beef. So the Yanks and the Rebs are going to get together. We're going to keep them eating, and they're going to keep us alive. So let's look at it that way. You know, this Chisholm Trail, as I started to say to you a minute ago, was a very fortunate thing. The way it came about was that soon after the war began, the Union government decided that the best thing to do was remove a lot of these Indians, get them out of the way so they wouldn't go on the warpath. So they moved them away up into Kansas, near a place called Caldwell. Now, at the end of the war, just in 1867, just a few years ago, they wanted to move those Indians back down into the Indian Territory, so they hired an old, well, he was a half-breed Cherokee. His name was Jesse Chisholm, and that's how this trail gets its name. Let me show you what he did. Here, I brought a map along here because we got to figure out where we're going. We've got to know where we are all the time. So what they did from way up here in this Kansas country, around this Caldwell, Kansas, was to hire Jesse Chisholm to build a trail all the way down here around this country near Fort Cobb so they could trail all those Indians back. Now, that meant Indians, squaws, papooses, travois, lodges, all the government troops that are going to escort them down there, all your teamsters with the supplies. Naturally, these rivers, just look here. Here you've got the Washita and the Canadian and the Cimarron, clear down to the Red River. But there are a lot of bad crossings on those rivers. So old Jesse figured the best way to do it was to take about 100 head of Indian ponies. Whenever he hit one of those cut banks, he'd run them off there until he'd knocked it down and really made a place for those wagon trains to go through. So that trail has been built all the way, let's say, from Fort Cobb up here to around Caldwell, Kansas. And that's where we're going with these critters. We're going to follow that trail. Now, you see, down here in Texas, we've got a lot of feeder trails now that come in here, and we cross the Red River. We just come to the east of Fort Cobb. We hit that Chisholm Trail and carry on up north, clear on up here to Abilene. Now, you see, that's where that railroad is building. Kansas Pacific is building across from Kansas City. They say they're going all the way to Denver. That's out in Colorado. But right now, the town that we're interested in is this town of Abilene. A fellow up there by the name of John McCoy got a great idea. That if we trail the cattle up there, he'd get the railroads to build stockyards and pens that we could load them right up into the cars and ship them out of there. Well, he's done it. Now it's up to us to bring him the cattle. Well, that's just about what we're doing. I was lucky enough to meet an old fellow before we started here on this trip. He'd come down that trail with those government wagons. He'd been a teamster. Then he went up with one of the first trail herds that started up here. He told me some things about that that are well worth remembering. One thing, in just a couple of days from now, we'll start to run into the Indian country. Now, he said it's all right when you get up in that Indian territory to go across Indian lands. But them fellas are going to come out there and they're going to demand tribute from you for every blasted trip and every trail herd that comes across here. And them Indians, they ain't a bit shy about asking for things. You'll see them come riding up here, a small war party of them, and Chief will sit on his horse there and he'll start talking signs to you. There's only one word they know. That's woha. That means beef. And he'll make a sign to you like that, just like them curved horns on a buffalo. Woha. That means beef. Then he'll say to you, you'll give me 10, 20, woha. Then you can cross our land. That's what that means. You can go across. But whittle him down. You got a bargain with him. Don't take his first offer. If he says 20, tell him you'll give him 3, and maybe you'll settle for 5. Because you're going to have the tab put on you every step of the way up there across that Indian country, and the first thing you know, you won't have a herd of cattle. That woha, funny enough, the Indians think that's English. Think English at all. You know, the first cattle they ever saw come out here was in the covered wagons. And they saw these critters drawing the covered wagons, and they looked like a buffalo, and that's the sign for the buffalo, so they said, that's sign for that fellow. So they could make the sign for our cattle, but they heard these fellows a cracking the whips and a hollering at them, hollering, whoa, and ha. So the Indian thinks that's the name for that critter. So he calls it woha. Now, when a white man hears the Indian say that, he thinks that's an Indian word for beef. Woha. That's the way an Indian says it. But it ain't no such thing. There's nothing but good old English. Whoa and a ha. So just remember that. When they holler woha, that means you got to give them beef. Now, get along with them, fellas, because there's lots of territory you got to get through, and they'll help you sometimes. Now, when you get to some of them rivers, now, you young fellas, I know a lot of you. You're good horsemen. You're old cavalry soldiers. You think that when you get to them rivers, well, you got 8 or 10 horses in your string, every one of you, and you want to ride your best horse across them rivers. Don't you do it. I'll tell you why. I know you got some half-broke broncs, and you got some half-trained things in your string there. Get the craziest headed horse that you can possibly find, one that throws his head, throws himself over, humps his back and bucks with you, and that ain't got a lick of sense, and when you come to them river crossings, ride him. And I'll tell you why. Because you'll come out sometimes on a bed of quicksand. Now, a good, sensible horse, when he gets in that quicksand, he'd go kind of slow-like. But when he does, he's going to sink lower and lower and lower and lower. But that crazy-headed varmint, get on him, and the minute a foot sticks, he's going to throw himself rare and pitch, and he'll take you out of there just like greased lightning. Now, just remember that. Sounds crazy, but just remember I told you. And then he went on to tell me about some of the other things that we'd meet along the trail. He spoke of those river crossings. Now, these critters that we've brought out of Texas are old moss-horn steers, a lot of them. Most of them have been running wild. They're afraid of a man. And now we've rounded them up, and we've put them in a trail herd, and we're starting them north. Another thing this old fellow told me about was, he said, you don't know much about the country, and you can't tell whether you're following a trail herd or not, or whether you're following a trail that a herd's gone over. It might have been a bunch of buffalo. So you're liable to get sheared off in the wrong direction. So when you come into camp at night, night's set down, the stars are out, just take the pole of your wagon, just take that wagon tongue and point her straight toward the North Star. And then in the morning when you hitch up, you move out straight and you're headed north, and that's the right direction. Don't forget that. Now, them are some of the things that I want to tell you young fellas that are coming up that trail. Well, he told me a lot of other things, but I was interested particularly in what he had to tell me about those cattle. The way to handle them on the trail. It's a new business to all of us, boys. We've all got to learn it. I know a lot of you young fellas have been in the rebel cavalry, and you think when anything happens, you have to rear back and let a big squall out of you that's going to scare something. But don't scare the cattle. These things that I've told you, and that this old-timer told me, you may live to tell your grandchildren that you took one of the first trail herds that ever went north over the Chisholm Trail.
Join us for another authentic story of the West when we again meet America's favorite Western storyteller, Tim McCoy. It's time for Tim McCoy.
In looking over this cowboy gear, a lot of people are apt to ask, does the cowboy just wear that stuff for effect, or is it useful? Well, of course, through the years, they may have fancied up a lot of their equipment, but every article that a cowboy has in his possession, everything he wears, everything he uses, is mighty important in the life of a cowboy. Now, take the saddle, for instance. The saddle, of course, as the old Texas Rangers used to say, the saddle's our home and the sky is our roof. Well, that's what a cowboy works in. There's his workbench. And you see that horn on the saddle? Whenever he's roped a critter or a horse, he can take his galleys around that horn, and that acts as a snubbing post. And it has to be strong because just think of the weight that's thrown on that saddle sometimes with a 1,000-pound steer on the end of a rope. So it has to be big and strong and stout, you see. Of course, some cowboys think that this thing was put on for another purpose. You've heard of grabbing leather? When a fellow's on a bucking horse, very often he'll reach down and get a hold of that thing to steady himself. But you know, every time I've ever been bucked off a horse, I never could find it. I always kept reaching for it, and I generally pick up a handful of sagebrush. I've known fellows that said, it's no sin to pull leather. If you get on a tough horse, reach down and get a hold of that thing. That's what the good Lord put it there for. Now these stirrups, these don't look much like the stirrups you see on a flat saddle, kind that's used in parks, English hunting, that sort of thing. But a cowboy has to have a great big open stirrup because half the time in mounting a bronc, he isn't going to get time to fish around and set that on his foot. He's got to spear it on the fly, so he wants something as big and heavy, it'll be right there so his foot will go right in it. Now, as far as those stirrups are concerned, there's a bit of equipment that goes over them. Here, we call them taps. Most of the expressions you have in cowboy lore are Spanish, Mexican, because the cattle industry came up out of Mexico, came up into Texas and the border states, then moved on up north. So with it came a language that came out of the south. And these were called tapaderos. Now this protection for the feet, those taps fit right over the stirrup, and down in that southern country where they have a lot of brush, chaparral, cactus, they're a great protection because they keep cactus spines and thorns from running into a man's feet. I can remember one time when we used to wear them up north, too. Not so much for brush, because we weren't in such a brushy country, but we wore them in the wintertime, and we lined them with heavy, heavy sheepskin, just to keep our feet warm. So there's a reason for those things. Cowboy expression is taps, chaps, and latigo straps. Now, chaps is nothing but an abbreviation of the word chaparreros. Now, this chaparrero comes from what the Spanish used to call armas. It meant armor or protection. And then they came to these armetas, which were very short, and then the chaparrera, which a man would wear in the brush, and those leather chaps, you see, protect a man going through rough brush and keep him from getting all skinned up. Now, these ornaments, these conchos down the side, yes, they're ornamental, but they have a purpose also. They hold the rings, you see, that snap the inside of those bat-wing chaps. Now, some chaps are made without those, and the legs are sewn right up solidly. That's why I call them stovepipe legs. So you put your foot right in them like you would a stovepipe. Now, we've got a number of chaps around here somewhere. Oh, here's the type that we used to use up in our country that might interest you. You don't see them down south. They all wore them up north. And that's the Angoras. Now, in the wintertime, or even in the cold rains in the spring and in the fall, a leather chap will just turn water about so long. And then around your knees, the water will soak in. But with these Angoras, it took an awful lot of snow or rain to get through and get your leg wet. They were the nicest things in the wintertime, particularly because they kept you very warm riding. And they use them up north now. They're still used all through those northern states of Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, Idaho, over the border into Canada. So when you see those Angoras on a man, he isn't wearing them just to be fancy. He's trying to keep warm in cold weather. And these ropes, well, the cowboy's rope, lariat, rieta as we call it, or a throw rope as a lot of them call it. Youngsters call it a lasso. Well, this is a grass rope. It's manila hemp. Now, those ropes are fine except when they get wet. They're tougher than a rawhide rope. They'll stand more strain, but in wet weather, a braided rawhide like this one, water has very little effect on it. They're all full of grease and oil anyway, and they're one of the finest ropes made. Most of the southern fellows will use those. They didn't use them up north very much because we had bigger, heavier cattle up there, and the cowboys would tie their ropes hard and fast on the saddle horn so that when they roped a critter, he could go to the end of it. But with these, if he went to the end of a small rawhide like that, he'd break it. So they take their dallies around the saddle horn and then let him run to the end of it, and you just see the smoke coming off that saddle horn, and they slowed him down gradually. So there's a little difference in the equipment that we use up north and the equipment that's used in the south. Well, then there's our boots, for instance. You wonder about a cowboy's boot. Yes, they've gotten pretty fancy through the years, but they've always been fairly fancy. Now, here's a pair that I had made not long ago. And the reason this design is on there, it's because of my years of association with the Indians, and I've had my bootmaker dress this up with war bonnets. Now, when you get to that high heel, people say, why do they wear that high heel? Well, it's very useful. In the first place, you saw that big open stirrup back there. If that were a flat heel, your foot could go clear through that stirrup. You might be thrown or a horse fall with you. Your foot would hang up in there and you'd be dragged to death. But that high heel keeps your foot from going through that big open stirrup, and there's a great protection. Then sometimes when you're on the ground and you've roped a horse in the corral, you can rear back and dig in those heels and you're just like a snubbing post. You don't slip along the top of the ground, you see. So there's a reason for the high heel. The fanciness, well, that's the cowboy's idea. We dress them up in different ways. Now, on the boot, you'll find the cowboy spurs. Now, there's an old pair of spurs that I used on the range for many years. They're not very fancy, but they're just a good work-a-day spur. But the ones that I've worn mostly from the time I came into pictures and in all my activities are these. Now, you hear how they ring? That's because there's good steel, of course, in the bands and in the shank. And then the rowels are made of silver steel. And when you step off a horse, they make a mighty pretty sound. As I said before, most of our stuff came up from Mexico. And here is a pair of spurs. Listen to those. That's what we call, the cowboys up here call those Chihuahuas, because of the Mexican state of Chihuahua. But they don't have such a long shank. They all go in for a great big rowel. Now, those are all silver mounted. Listen to the ring on those. Here's a pair that came up from the Argentine. Now, this is going in pretty fancy because the concho on the side of these is made to resemble a sombrero. And then, of course, the rowels are encased in silver, and there's gold inlay all around them. One thing about these spurs you must remember, a cowboy never has sharp prongs on those rowels. No matter how big they are, the rowel is always dulled so that he doesn't cut a horse with them. All he wants to do is remind a horse to go ahead. Because if he's got his reins in one hand and the coils of his rope and a loop in the other, he's got both hands occupied, so the only thing he can do to indicate to his horse that he wants him to go ahead is use those spurs. But he doesn't want to hurt the horse, he just wants to remind him. So just remember that when you think it might be cruel. Oh, there's so many things about this cowboy gear here. Look at this muffler. Now, that's a big muffler. Not one of the little strings that you'll see tied around someone's neck in a moving picture, maybe. But this is the type that they used to wear on the range in my day. It had a lot of uses, you know. If you're trailing behind a bunch of cattle, the dust is rolling up on you, you'd pull your muffler up over your nose and wear it that way. Then even sometimes, in the wintertime, when you were cold, you could put it over your head, put your hat on top of it and tie it under your chin, and it kept your ears warm. You pulled your coat over the back of it and the wind didn't go down your neck. And there's nothing warmer on the ears than silk. So there were a dozen uses for that muffler, but it was always worn big and loose around the neck. It's practically passed out these days. And your cowboy hats, they don't wear the big ones anymore. But we used to. Now, there's some of my prize hats that I had made a long time ago. John B. Stetson. Some of the best of them. And this one, I always called the granddaddy of them all. Now, these hats are made out of the finest quality beaver. They protect you from the hot western sun, and on rainy days, they act as an umbrella. They hold their shape, nothing interferes with them, and you've always got protection, as I say, from sun and rain. That's why we like the big hats. When I say they don't wear them that big, well, there were only a few of us wore them that big in the old days. Now, if taken all together, the general effect, well, you find it pretty picturesque. Well, it's not exactly the cowboy's fault, but as I say, when they're taken all together and then they're analyzed, each and every one of these things I've told you about now are pretty important in the life of the cowboy.
Join us for another authentic story of the West when we again meet America's favorite Western storyteller, Tim McCoy.